15 years, and I don't think we've ever done anything like this, so it will get less awkward. We're doing a podcast. We maybe share a bit about why we're doing this?
Yeah, definitely. I think, do you want to start?
Sure. I think about when the company was very small, we were able to have a lot of kind of in-depth conversations with a lot of people across the product and engineering teams. And a lot of that was actually just, around the lunch table. You could be talking for half an hour about how we're thinking about things, what we're trying, what we're building towards. And I think that context helped people understand what we were trying to do so they could figure out more ways to have impact, help them make better decisions, help them come up with ideas. And as the company's gotten bigger, those types of interactions just get harder to do, right, over Zoom and with small teams. And so this is kind of an experiment, but I think the idea is to be able to explore some of these ideas in more depth, talk about what we're thinking about, including kind of thoughts that are still being formed or areas that we're kind of learning about, and let people know kind of what's on our minds and how they can help. So.
Yeah, makes sense. I think the other interesting thing on the topic that we were going to talk about today with AI is really interesting too, just because actually the stuff going on in the world is changing so fast. And, there's a lot of details about how to use it or what tools, but even bigger than that, I think just actually working through how should we think about it a little bit and what's some of the context? It's not exactly like a 30-second, discussion. And I think it's important just that folks have a little bit more of the info about, how we're thinking about that and where we see it going.
For sure. So I think today we're going to focus on AI and really kind of how it's impacting how we work internally. We've got bunch of other topics we would love to go into. But maybe before we get into it, what the name, Object Stats, you want to share for those who don't know where the term came from, what it means? And
Yeah, definitely. So Object Stats, for folks that aren't familiar with, we have one of the first things we had to do as an IoT company was really work on our kind of time series database so we could pull a lot of data in, store it in the back end, and then start understanding how that data worked and present it to users in forms of charts and graphs and stuff like that. It was kind of like a fundamental underpinning of a lot of the stuff we did, and we called them object stats because we, kind of had a general concept, weren't really sure how it would play out over time, but knew we needed some abstraction like that. So we felt like it was a pretty, it's kind of an interesting case, and I think, was a good name for the show, just because I think, in a similar kind of vein, we're going to talk about some topics that that we know are changing a lot. It's going to be pretty fundamental, so the stuff going on, but we weren't sure exactly where it would go and what path it would lead us down.
The names like object stats and widgets,
yes,
a lot of flexibility.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So maybe getting into it, I think you're pretty unusual or unique in that you're co-founder of a nearly 4,000 person company, but you're still writing a lot of production code, and right now a lot around routing and other areas of the product. But we talk a lot about how AI has changed how you've been working, what tools you've been using, your workflows. Maybe you can share with folks a bit about how your day-to-day work as an engineer has changed over the last maybe 6 to 12 months, and what are the tools and workflows that you're finding most useful for you right now?
Yeah, definitely. So it's been really fascinating to watch the kind of evolution of AI, and I think probably I really started using a lot of the tools 6 to 9 months ago, and trying them out. ChatGPT was there. I think, and then I started using Cursor a lot when it first came out because I felt like I should try it. One fascinating thing about these, and I've been really passionate about it, just because even a couple of years ago, even when ChatGPT came out, you saw the hints of where it would go. It would spit out code. It was actually pretty reasonable, and then watched listened to a lot of podcasts about how people were developing those particular apps. It was extremely expensive when ChatGPT first came out, and people were kind of like, well, how is this product even going to work? Because even typing a query in and getting an answer was quite expensive. But the cost has been coming down so much. I believe if you just start projecting out, it just means that all of these really sophisticated models are eventually going to be very cheap to run. And I think it will mean the current use cases are getting cheaper, and it will also mean that they will be able to process more and more data, whether that's like videos or other kind of stuff that previously just would have been cost prohibitive. And we're seeing major jumps, every 6 months in the capability of these. So I think that means everything's going to just start changing like pretty quickly. And we've kind of seen it in some of how these products have been developing. I can tell you, whether it's using Cursor or Windsurf or some of those other tools, the capabilities have been changing every 3 to 6 months. Like there was stuff that you could try 6 months ago that wouldn't have worked, or maybe a change you could ask it to make. And then through some slight UI tweaks or other things, or just an updated model from one of the newer Claude models, they've just been getting significantly better, which is crazy to think that the products can actually change that much over a short period of time.
I'm curious. I've been playing with Cursor for weekend projects, and I haven't really been writing production code in well over a decade. But it's pretty amazing because I know what I want to build. I don't remember some of the syntax. I certainly not up to speed on all the libraries that are available, and it can actually just fill in all those blanks, and it's pretty amazing. I'm curious, have you had any kind of recent moments where you've tried something that maybe hasn't worked 3 to 6 months ago, but it's working, and you're actually seeing it being really useful in terms of kind of getting production code built?
Yeah, I think I can tell you probably my first aha moment with it. I was working with a couple of engineers on the route planning stuff, and there were some aspects of our system that I just hadn't touched in a couple of years, and I couldn't remember how it worked. And it was the first time I ended up using Cursor and was using a lot of and the interesting thing about Cursor, it will, in a way that other tools hadn't been able to do before, like ChatGPT, if you ask it to solve a problem or an algorithm, it can spit out Python code to do it pretty easily. I think the interesting thing that Cursor started doing was they were actually indexing the code base. So when you ask it a question, it actually it generated embeddings for this, so it could essentially consult your code base and then actually be able to hand you relevant information in a way that ChatGPT, without hooking up to the code base, couldn't do. The first time I probably tried this, I couldn't remember how tags worked in our system. Like, you want to apply a tag to a driver or something. And we needed this for some of the routing stuff we were working on. I was working with one of the engineers that was working on the problem, and I wanted to have some technical feedback for him because I was going to look at his PR. So the initial thing I did, I sat down with Cursor and was just ask it. I was like, and it was something about this long. I need to add tags to this data structure. Can you find other examples in the code base and tell me the diff to do it? How would I do it? And it just immediately came back with an answer that was like 80% correct, and something where I didn't have to go read through a bunch of code to do it. And that was my first moment where I was like, oh, this is super powerful. In part because now I can have a productive conversation, with the engineer, or look at his code and kind of think through. And that was the first moment where I was like, well, that's still a little bit of a debugging use case or exploration, but it has been interesting as we've been talking about it with a lot of other folks. It's been such a powerful tool, not just for the engineers working on it, but even the engineering managers who might not be writing code themselves, but still need to be kind of in the code to help understand what work needs to be done, what are the dependencies, how should something be structured, and I think that's super powerful. But that was probably the first aha moment, if that makes sense, where I was like, it was doing something that I didn't actually, quite expect would work,
right?
Which was pretty cool.
Yeah, I remember recently trying something and was building a UI, and it actually built out a V0 UI, and it looked like Windows 95 software. And I just said, this looks like Windows 95 software. Let's make it more modern. And it made 3 different CSS versions and compared them. And it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. Like, what have you been using it for? I feel like.
Well, let's see. So my first project was actually, we were realizing that it was with Zoom, it's really easy to add huge numbers of people to meetings. And if you're working in person, if you want to have a 150 or 200 person meeting, it's a big deal. You have to get a giant room. And with Zoom, you can just add a list, and people's calendars were getting really full. And so I built kind of an offline analysis script to basically go through and understand meeting load, and then which of the meetings were driving the most kind of time or cost in the team, and finding areas where maybe we could reduce them. And it was hundreds of megs of CSV data, so more than you can do in a Google Sheet or Excel. So you had to get into Python, and there was a bunch of edge cases of people, joining and then leaving and rejoining, and just being able to handle all of that. It probably took it further than it needed to go, but it was fun. And then actually recently, we've been working on just looking at our org design and kind of working on our hiring plan for the year ahead. And what I wanted to do is be able to see for all of R&D, what is the shape of the org in terms of, for each team, how far away are the individual contributors from Sanjit? So kind of what's the org depth, understanding where people are split geographically and might have to be coordinating across time zones, understanding the seniority of teams. So for a given group of people, what fraction are senior and staff engineers, what are mid-career, what are earlier career, and kind of be able to understand where there might be teams that are overweighted or underweighted in certain areas, or have some adjustments we want to make. And you would think that Workday would do this, but it doesn't. And so we built a really nice kind of org explorer, right, that takes the Workday data and then kind of figures out all of these things that we care about in an interactive kind of UI. So it's a combination of a problem I was trying to solve and also just fun weekend projects.
It's quite effective at generating software, like you're saying.
One of the things I noticed building these side projects is, if you have a vision for what you want to build and you just tell it to go build it, it can't, at least in my use cases, couldn't generate 1,000 lines of code one shot and have it work. You have to kind of think like an engineer and start with the smallest thing, then expand it and kind of test as you go. And I was thinking to myself, well, that's kind of what it does today. In 1 or 2 years, is that even that distinction going to change? And I guess I'm curious, you're obviously much deeper into these than I am in terms of using them for production use cases. What are some of the things that maybe they don't do today that you think they're likely to do in the not too distant future? And kind of thinking about what didn't work 6 months ago that now works today. There should be things that we're trying today that aren't quite there, but soon will be possible. And maybe what's your, if you run your kind of next token generator for these tools, what do you think they'll look like?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting notes. So one is, even Cursor today versus like 6 months ago has improved quite a bit. A lot of the things that they're doing now is they can they will recommend commands to run, if you need to set up something or something like that. Whereas 6 months ago, it wouldn't quite do that. It would just spit out code and then let you kind of apply it. So I think it's going to get more sophisticated about that. There's obviously a lot of the stuff that I've seen other engineers do are try to use Cursor, these tools, in kind of a semi-automated way. So, it could be I'm rewriting or need to go through and refactor big pieces of the code base. I've seen a bunch of the engineers will essentially have prompt snippets that they'll use and say hey, I need to make this change to the file. Here's what I've done previously. And that works pretty well. And they just go through one by one on the files. I think in the future, obviously, stuff like that will start to be put together a little bit better. And then the other one is really large code changes right now are pretty hard. I've heard and been using, I've tried out Windsurf, which is exactly like Cursor, and I think it's one of the awesome things about being a consumer in this in the space, if that makes sense, is that these tools, everybody's kind of figured out the API right now is VS Code. So there's a bunch of VS Code kind of clones essentially that are all going to do this, and Windsurf a lot of folks have been saying that it's better at making changes to larger code bases. Like they've done some work there to make that more effective. And I've seen it to be the case, but I think this is obviously an area where all of the tools are going to catch up as the models start to get trained on larger code bases, and people are figuring out that this is an area that they need to improve. So I definitely think that's one spot. I think the other interesting one that I think we need to think about this a little bit. All of the code that the AI gets trained on or is public, or I should say, any code that is public, the AIs are going to get trained on. And so I kind of think it means being able to use standard libraries and stuff that's kind of off the shelf versus like having internal bespoke stuff is going to be a better pattern to follow. And I think that has some implications on trade-offs between like, how should we invest in things? How should we invest in writing our own custom software? What are the APIs that we should use? And how should we think about when to either rewrite something or use something off the shelf? Has some different implications. So I think that'll be interesting to see just how the models change, and then how I think we need to think about how to make actually our code easier for AI models to interact with and write, over the next few years.
I think we've seen a version of this before in the past. We were both doing a lot of kind of back-end systems code when AWS first came out, right? And I remember one of the first really well publicized use cases was the New York Times using it. And this was just EC2 and S3. And their photographers would basically upload these big high-res digital photos, and they'd need to go create a bunch of thumbnails. And it was bursty, it wasn't latency sensitive. If something went down, they could just restart the job, et cetera. So they used it for thumbnail generation instead of having to go buy and manage servers to do that in their colos or data centers. And early on, people said, hey, this is it's a really neat technology, but it's really only kind of usable for these sort of side use cases, like the equivalent of my Cursor side projects, right? You wouldn't really use it in production code. And then it started being used by startups for production apps. And people said, well, yeah, it's good for startups, but you can't use it if you're an enterprise. And then all of a sudden, enterprises were starting to use it, but they said, sure, but certainly not for for anything that requires security. And then the next thing you know, I think the CIA had an AWS cloud, and you kind of got to see every sort of objection of, hey, but it's not going to work for this. It's not going to work for this. You saw them go away, and that happened over 10 years. And here it seems like that's happening just an order of magnitude faster.
It's super compressed. Yeah,
super compressed.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. And I think everybody kind of initially has a fear-based reaction to all this stuff. They're like, oh, is it going to take over my job? And I don't think it's the case. I think this is kind of an interesting transition we're going through. And I think the parallels are kind of it's like moving from assembly programming to, C, and just moving kind of one level up the stack. It's still really handy to have and really understand kind of at a low level, how computers work and just what the fundamentals are. And I don't think that is going to change over time. I do know that even today with these new models that can kind of spit out a bunch of code, like you said, a lot of it is more appropriate for prototyping right now and things like that. It does start to shift the work, as in I feel like now folks that kind of can prompt really well and communicate, which is effectively being able to communicate very well about what you actually want the models to spit out and how to approach a problem is incredibly important. I definitely know, if you ask, and a lot of the context around what you're trying to do or what you're trying to accomplish is incredibly important, right? Because, you might be writing a prototype and it might be really important, like you said earlier or alluding to, that if, it was too much data to load in a particular mode or something, if you can articulate that to the AI, it probably will be able to take that into consideration. But if it doesn't have any idea, it's still going to potentially spit out, a bad solution. So I think communications and precise communication is going to be really important. And then I think the other thing that I definitely noticed is there are times where actually being able to debug stuff or find bugs in the code or being able to articulate what the bug is is incredibly important, and that's a kind of a fundamental thing, I think, to folks that are programming. And then the third one that I've ended up spending, I feel like I've ended up reading much more code, and whether that's like actually doing code reviews of what the AI kind of spits back, or doing architectural reviews for like actually how to set up a bunch of different modules so I can split it up and have AI like write the individual pieces, because I know it's not quite capable yet of like constructing everything in one shot. I think those kind of skills are going to continue. Like those have always been important, but in effect, I think what these tools are doing is actually just taking a lot of the drudgery out, right? Like, I think those are really like the fun parts, of programming, and I think why I'm so excited. The other thing I've noticed is like, man, I feel like in terms of what I've been asking other folks to do and what I've been doing myself, it's amazing at writing tests. Like just because like, if you're going to focus on like an area of code, trying to figure out how to do it, then it's almost a mode shift to figure out like how to test it. But the AI can usually do a very good job of coming up with things, and that's kind of amazing. Like, so I feel like there's a bunch of those. These are kind of, I feel like, fundamental skills, right? Are always really important to work on it. I don't think those are really going to change, but it will kind of change the scope of what a lot of folks can work to, because whereas before, I think if you were an expert in one area, I feel like it wouldn't have been on the table to go build a front end, right? So if you're a back-end engineer and you want to, your own way to UI for using something or testing out a tool, you could do that. I think the other thing is like, it really is changing what it means to work with other people for ideas and stuff like that, because now you can go through and actually, instead of showing up with a document that might describe the problems you're trying to solve, you could show up with that and a prototype that you built, in 30 minutes to an hour before a meeting. And being able to communicate like that with a very specific instance of what user flow would look like in the software that you've written, I think is just super powerful and lets you accelerate a lot of work that previously, like, it may have taken like, weeks to kind of work through.
It's interesting talking to early stage startups as well as startup investors, right? Where I think we're hearing people basically say that they're building prototypes, they're raising funding off these prototypes, and often these prototypes are 95 to 100% AI generated by, two people, right? And they're not production systems. They don't have to integrate with large production systems. So it's kind of closer to the prototyping use case. But what's super cool about it is if you have a vision for what you want to build, you can actually express that very, very quickly, right? Without needing to convince lots of people. If you're a startup, that means you don't have to go raise a lot of money. If you're within Samsara, you don't have to get, multiple teams to dedicate roadmap time. You can actually show what's possible, show your idea so quickly in a real working product. And it seems like the world's going to be really, really exciting for people who have a vision for what they want to build, right? Because there's just so fewer obstacles to getting that started. Probably less hours in the day going to be spent on kind of the drudgery of filling in the blanks over time, which I think for all of us is a great thing. But it seems like that creativity, right, is the piece that the AI can't do. And being able to, this is why we spend so much time figuring out how do we get people more customer context, more business context to kind of get those ideas, because it's getting easier and easier to actually express them, which I think is super exciting.
Yeah, it makes sense. And actually, Kenshiro's here. Welcome, Kenshiro.
Yeah, thanks.
Can you tell the folks a little bit about yourself for folks that aren't familiar with what you do at Samsara?
Yeah, so I'm a senior engineering manager here at Samsara. I lead our smart maps team. So we work on ways to, look at our scale of data. We collect so much data from all of our different customers, and what are insights that we can build based on that scale of data that provide value in lots of different ways. Like a lot of the work that our customers do is maybe specific to a location. And if you're looking at an list view versus like a map view, you might understand the data differently. So we're looking for opportunities like that.
Makes sense. That's awesome. I know I've seen a lot of demos you guys have been building, and the features are pretty great. And I know we've also been getting them in front of customers, and it's a huge response from them about the stuff you guys have been building. Part of, we've been talking a lot about AI. And I think one of the reasons why we wanted to have you on is because I know when we looked at actually the teams that have been using the AI tools, like your team was at the top of the leaderboard, if that makes sense. And I know you've actually been involved in kind of championing these tools for the last like 6 to 9 months.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear kind of from you, like why did you start using them, and what was kind of going through your thought process about why you thought they were interesting and what you saw they could kind of do at the time.
Yeah. So I started using, I guess ChatGPT was the first way I started using LLMs in work. And my team is working in an area where there's not a lot of existing patterns. And we didn't really know exactly what the product would look like. And we're also working in the geospatial space where we don't have experts on the team already. So just thinking in terms of like asking questions and getting a lay of the land, I found ChatGPT super useful because you don't need to go find someone to ask questions. You can kind of get a lot of like pretty straightforward answers quickly and do a lot of research. But I think until we started using Cursor, that was really the moment where it's kind of remarkable how much the way we work has shifted. But I would say these days with the editor, I spend most of my time thinking and communicating in English to the editor, whether it's dictation or just typing in different props to the composer chat. Because now, I mean, I would say like the cost of writing code has just dropped dramatically. So, at an individual level, right, that means if I don't know how to use some specific React component, I can do that a lot faster. The team dynamic has been really cool to see. So now I can expect all of my teammates to be using the same set of tools. And therefore, we're actually more demanding on each other about the kind and quality of code they can output, because you can, in a pull request, for example, say, hey, we want this to be a lot more readable. I think if you change a bunch of things in a subtle way, it would be easier for us to understand. But now that kind of change is so easy for us to do. Previously, you might say, oh, well, I don't want to send you, another round trip to take a lot more time. So those kinds of changes become much easier for us. So it's cool to see the team's output change as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. How did it kind of spread? I mean, I think you were kind of like the seed, if that makes sense, on the team. But like, I'm curious if you found, as people started to use the tools, if it was kind of a similar process that they kind of went through about just trying to learn about where it works and where it doesn't. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I was the first to try. I think I was one of the first trial users to get a peek at Cursor, and I just had this mind blown moment where I was like, oh, I'm actually not typing the code anymore. I would say 95% or more of the code I write is being generated for me, and I don't know, it was just crazy to me how other people couldn't work in this way, but it just made sense that there's some bar where if you just haven't tried it, you don't know what it's capable of. So because it changed my way of thinking, I was like, okay, I got to sit down with my team. I got to show you what this is like. So it was a series of demos and, asking people like, what problem are you solving? Let's try using Cursor. And then people kind of see, like, each person on my team had their own mind blown moment where suddenly it's like, oh, they get it, right? I don't really need to explain anymore. So on my team, that's how we drove adoption.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you remember the first time you used Google? Like, was it kind of like that in a way, or like, I've been trying to figure out like what the parallels are, especially for folks that haven't like adopted the tools yet, if that makes sense. Because it seems like there needs to be some like activation, or someone kind of needs to show them like, hey, here's actually what it's capable of if you want to try it out.
I think people have been kind of skeptical. I think maybe in particular with dev tooling, people tend to be kind of precious about their tooling, right? People invest a lot of time because it really can affect what you can get done, right? Like if you have your own pattern, that's super fast, but if you lose your keyboard shortcuts, like you slow way down just in the mechanical part of writing code. I think recognizing that it's not a silver bullet, it's not going to do your thinking for you, but telling people like, hey, this is a tool that is just going to make what you do way faster, has been able to, I don't know, that's been like a useful way to kind of crack the nut. Like, you're not giving up, any agency. You're actually getting a lot more of it by not having to think about some of the smaller details.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I'm curious, how do you keep up to speed with how these tools are changing? Like, taking Cursor as an example, like Cursor, they're adding a bunch of new features. There are more capable models that are being used under the covers. And we were talking earlier about how you might try a thing and it doesn't work, and then 3 months later or 6 months later, it does. And I could actually see people getting in a trap of actually dismissing things. Like, this doesn't work, or it hallucinates, or what have you, writing something off, and then all of a sudden there's this like huge productivity wave that you could miss out on. So it seems like you guys have been doing a good job of actually kind of keeping that flexibility, mental flexibility and curiosity. But tactically, how do you stay on top of it when it's changing so quickly?
It's a good question. I'm sure there's features that have come out already that I'm not, fully deploying. I really think once you kind of break the dam, like once you're actually using this tooling, you're just like hungry for more. Like, what is, like, your perception of what is possible has changed. And therefore, and it is also very clear at this point that the tooling is going to get better. Like, these things are going to get better, not just, more advanced LLMs, but the integration into how we work with LLMs is going to really change, I think. Like, for example, today, you have to add specific files into the context to to have a better understanding of the code you want to generate. But I'm sure in the future, you're not going to need to do all these mechanical things to get the right output. Cursor is just one company, right, that's building this kind of LLM tooling. So having some awareness of what else is out there. I use Windsurf at home, which is kind of a similar product, and it's cool to see each company come out with some new features. So maybe it's just a hobby for me, but I think there's a real professional benefit to just keeping up with what's changing and thinking about like what can help my day-to-day, because we're just at the very beginning, I feel. So even small improvements, like, oh my gosh, this is way easier to use now. Like small, like low-hanging fruit improvements to the coding, to the tooling, is really meaningfully improving, my day-to-day.
Yeah, it's interesting how these AI coding tools like really have been getting adopted quickly, kind of at the same time that we've been shifting the way we've been building products and features at Samsara, in terms of really focusing on frequent demos, getting customer feedback early, and building more iteratively. And I'm curious, between that change and the new tools, has it affected how you think of sequencing projects, especially kind of bigger ones?
Yeah. I would say the biggest change for us, and you're right, it's a combination of the tooling changing the calculus and where you want to spend your time, and also just adapting the way we work to get more customer signal. I would say we used to do a lot more of the design up front, right? Think about what are things that we can reuse, because time is precious, right? Like writing code is, you're spending time doing that. So you want to make sure you get as much out of it as possible. And maybe like, I haven't really teased out, if it's like one or the other. I think it's a combination of both. But now what, I personally do and what my team, is excited to do is just to get something out. Like, it's much cheaper now just to get something out. And it might be a bad idea, but we don't necessarily know. So having shorter reps where we're doing some design and then some code and then get some feedback. And then great, now we know way more than we did before. Let's do another round of design, coding, and then more feedback. Whereas before it was more like design, and then like code, and then, hopefully we got everything right the first time. So it just feels way like we're still getting like failures and learnings, but we're injecting them much earlier into the process. So I feel like, by the time we get to something that's pretty good, like we've learned a lot of lessons along the way, and that gives us a lot of confidence that, we're not, we don't have some like really basic mistake.
Right. And it applies on the architecture design as well as the UX design, right? What you would need to do in Figma versus what you can prototype in code, that is shifting as well, which I think is super powerful, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think because, again, the cost of coding is so much lower now. I was doing some front-end work recently, and this is like a map visualization. I was thinking, like, I'm not sure if it's working. Like, is the data stale? Like, I'm kind of trying some things. I'm not sure. Let me just animate it. Like, let me just add some, shimmers to see when it updates, like, draw it in a nice color. And I think before it would have taken so much time to set something like that up, but now I have these like verbose logs in my web inspector. The page is telling me what's going on as it's happening, and it's almost no work for me to do that. So it's really cool to be able to just say like, I wish I had this thing. Like, let me just do that, and a lot of those things become more commoditized.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think especially it's always been an issue of mine of trying to understand how much work is going to be throwaway, if that makes sense, and actually what is appropriate. And I feel like you're kind of calling this out, which actually if the cost to write code is much less, and it's not even as mentally taxing to go through and do it, it kind of lets you be a little bit more risky in ideas that you're trying out and stuff like that in a way where I feel like it's different. And you alluded to this on the PR front when you're asking, it's like, oh, if you feel more comfortable asking somebody to go back and make a change you feel like really should be done, but it's going to cost them a lot of work, right? Like, it's like, it kind of makes, it's easy to see how this actually can nudge almost the types of work that we're doing, and even some of the quality stuff up, which is kind of an unexpected side benefit, I think. And I wouldn't have initially thought that would have been the case if that makes sense for some of the tools, but totally interesting.
Well, there are so many questions that I want to ask actually about how AI and LLMs are changing the kinds of products we can build for customers, but they're going to have to put a pin in that for next time. But thank you for joining us and for sharing. And it's been really awesome to see the work your team's been doing. And every time we show it to customers, their eyes light up. And it's been a lot of fun. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome.
So awesome discussion, and it was great having Kenshiro share his perspective. Maybe we're out of time, so closing thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely think kind of my call to action for folks would be to go out and try some of these tools on some of the either personal projects, or if you're doing data analysis, there are a bunch of kind of easy wins if you haven't been booting up on how to do them. And definitely, I know we have a bunch of channels on where to use it, but the biggest thing I've ended up finding is like finding a buddy, an AI buddy, to just try it out with, go back and forth and share ideas with. So that'd be my kind of ask for folks.
100%. And I think that applies for folks outside of engineering as well. If you're a designer or a PM, or you're working in another part of R&D, try this stuff out. And it's super helpful to explore ideas as well as help us build products.
Awesome.
All right. Well, that was fun. Looking forward to doing it again.
Absolutely.